And so as we think about the different batteries, energy sources required to power this ancient tradition, this ancient story, this morning, I'm going to say a few words about what I bring. That's probably why I didn't fall asleep till 4 o'clock this morning. Because it's kind of with mixed feelings that I think about talking about myself and my history with such great detail, and then having had to think about my history all day, was kept alive or awake half the night than really thinking about it. But as a way of introducing you to what for me has always been a deep understanding of my own calling, I'm going to read to you from probably a fairly little-known passage from the book of Exodus. And you remember at that point the Israelites are living in Egypt as slaves, and the Pharaoh is afraid that they are going to rise to power because there's so many of them. And so he has a plan to kill all of the male children. But there's a couple of midwives who get involved and, for no other better term, create some holy mischief. And I've always had a really deep connection to this passage because of the way I understand my own role in this tradition as to serve as a midwife, which I'll say more about later. The Pharaoh called in the 2 women who helped the Hebrew mothers when they gave birth. He told them, if a Hebrew woman gives birth to a girl, let the child live. If the baby is a boy, kill him. However, the 2 women were faithful to God and did not kill the boys. The Pharaoh called them in again and asked, why are you letting those baby boys live? They answered, Hebrew women have their babies much quicker than Egyptian women. And by the time we arrive, their babies are already born. How's that for holy mischief? So let me begin by suggesting that our own unique terroir will always animate, give life to, facilitate our understanding of this tradition and how we live it. All right? And I'm going to give you the example of myself. And like I say, I'm not going to do this again. Okay? Feels very... On the other hand, let's not kid ourselves. We belong to a tradition that is a storied tradition and a tradition passed on by community. So the community that we are today, in many ways, is a result of all of the communities that we came from. So a bit about my terroir. My mother grew up on this farm in New Zealand. She did not experience the kind of poverty that my father did while growing up in the Depression here in Canada. She went to a very good school in the city called Wellington, and at the age of 21 was a debutante. She did, however, on the night of the debutante ball, have to go back to work. She had trained as a nurse and a midwife. My dad grew up poor, Grey County, hardscrabble farming. But he grew up in a home where reading and literature and music and newspapers were central. I just discovered this quote yesterday on his obituary page. I'd never gone to look at it before, but this is from my oldest cousin. His love of adventure left me with a sense of risk-taking that has helped me to form the idea that nothing is impossible until I prove to myself that it cannot be done. So that was my dad. Their common love of adventure led them to the Mistawasis Indian Reserve. This is the picture from their home page. Just outside of Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. My mother, as a nurse, had traveled to England with her 3 best nursing friends. They'd nursed there for a couple years, traveled around Europe until one of them came to Canada, sent back a telegram and said, "You've got to get over here immediately. Indian Affairs is calling for British-trained nurses because they were all midwives, and obstetricians are not going on to the reserves for emergency deliveries." So my mother and her 3 friends were all assigned to reserves in northern Saskatchewan. And at one point, those foremost northern nursing stations in Saskatchewan were manned by these very adventuresome New Zealand nurses. She was assigned to the reserve where my dad had just been assigned by the Presbyterian Church of Canada. And keep in mind that in that era, the 50s, these reservations very much reflected third world conditions. So both my parents were very much committed to walking with the vulnerable. And I would say their lives kind of took them off the beaten track. My mother stayed there for a year, returned to New Zealand. They corresponded for 3 years. And then my dad, ever the adventurer, bought a ticket to go around the world, stopped off in New Zealand, and proposed. They took up their life together at the Waiwisakapo First Nation Reserve in southern Manitoba. No running water. That is where I was born. My earliest memories involved growing up on First Nation reserves. I remember one of my earlier school memories that some of the girls in the classroom had, I don't know what their crime was, but as a result, they were all given the strap. As a 7-year-old, I could barely stomach it. I think that working among the Indigenous community was also very hard for my dad. He could see that that system that our nation had put in place was not working for anyone. He tried to encourage self-sufficiency. He wrote letters to the government. On more than one occasion, he attempted to introduce different farming practices, but I think the situation was so far gone into crisis that none of these efforts came to much. It wasn't until I was about 9 that we moved into a city. Yet still a number of things shaped our household in a way that I thought anyway made us a little bit different, borderline weird when compared to households of my peers. Probably the best story to explain this is what happened the day of the annual Red Cross bingo at Ashley Park Elementary School. One afternoon a year, all the kids got to miss school, go into the gym, play bingo, and raise money for the Red Cross, except the Donovans and the Ekdals. The Donovans, because we didn't gamble as good Presbyterians, and the Ekdals, because they were Jehovah's Witnesses. But there are a number of things that became clear, if not only by osmosis, because of the household I was raised in. In my household, there was never any clear distinction between politics and religion. My father served 2 terms as a city councilor, and he ran for political office because of his understanding of the just society founded in the Judaic-Christian tradition. My mother was one of those early brand of feminists. She would have had to have ended up being public health nurse on a reserve in northern Saskatchewan. She did not see any job as too big for the right kind of team. While she was never really outspoken about her beliefs, she just kept making things happen. In her mind, there could never be too many flowers or too much music in the world. And she'd say to me, "Don't even think about getting married until you're at least 30. Go and get your education and travel the world." But along with my father, she also had an eye for the vulnerable. I remember every Sunday morning on our way to church, we would pick up Frankie, who had cerebral palsy and was raised by his grandmother. My dad, in many ways, was probably the more iconic one. He was the public one. He was a keen environmentalist. We would stop on the side of the road and pick up garbage regularly. He would rail against the abuse of the earth. In fact, he would rail against a lot of things. He published essays regularly in the local paper. He believed that part of his role was calling for conversation in the public square around the common good. I remember that in one article, he was critical of the city of Swift Current's decision to abolish the Sabbath law. So the Sabbath law meant that stores were not allowed to open on Sunday, just your little corner grocery stores. For my dad, this was not so much a conversation about everybody ought to be in church on Sunday. No, it was a justice issue, because in his mind, faith and justice went hand in hand. And so he got out his pen and wrote, "Look, 6 days of the week, these large supermarkets like Safeway or the Co-op get the best of our business, while these small corner stores, usually supporting one family, very often an immigrant family, get our nickels and dimes. They make their biggest profit on Sunday when the large stores are closed. Why can't we continue to look after the smaller vendor?" he said. When I look at my own faith formation, it was not so much my participation in Sunday school and church that was significant. The churches that my parents served were always dying. My dad kept saying to the National Church, "Just send me where you need me, places where no one else will go." That's what it translated into. It was the faith that was operative in my household, in my terroir, that shaped my understanding of the Christian tradition. Now, having said this, in my teens, I completely rebelled against my parents' perspectives. When I turned 16, when other kids my age were being confirmed, I refused. I know my mother was horrified that when I declared that I was an agnostic. Yet it didn't mean I didn't continue to share those deep core values around the just society. And I thought that maybe I might want to pursue a life in politics. And so I did my own thing, traveled, worked, until I hit a bit of a crisis point, not knowing what I was supposed to do with my life. And, well, the crazy thing is, after looking at all of the options for community service, it seemed to me that the one that had the most potential for some fun and some creativity was this tradition that I had abandoned for a few years. Because as far as I could see, social workers had far too much paperwork and the potential for burnout. And politics, well, that was another game. At least in ministry, there was music and story and drama. So I went back and I knocked on the door, and it flew open. I ended up being a bit of a fish out of water while studying theology. I didn't exactly fit the mold. I may have challenged the powers that be once or twice. And believe me, privileged Protestant academics do not like to be challenged. We had to write a paper in our first year. It was 3 years, reflecting on our image for our own ministry. I had 2 visions for myself in ministry. I did feel called to be a bit of a prophet, not the John the Baptist kind of prophet, not the bad dogs kind. But given my formation, I had a keen sense of injustice in our midst and was keenly aware of my own privilege. And so it's no surprise that initiatives like 10,000 villages and Reaching for Rainbows, for me, were just completely connected to the biblical perspective and not just optional programs for Christians. The greatest demands of the prophets within the Old Testament were in the area of economic justice, and more specifically, make sure you look out for and include the vulnerable. And I could never figure out why the Church of Christendom, by and large, ignored some of the bigger challenges around justice and inclusion. The other image, probably more central for me, was that of midwife. One of my greatest strengths, and I tell people I can't do anything with my hands, and even trying to put some paint in those mandalas was a bit of a challenge for me. But I can see possibilities. I can see possibilities even in the midst of dying and disaster and grief. And then I love bringing teams of people together to give birth to those possibilities. Jesus promised that this vision would bring abundant life. Abundant life is not born by following the rules or by doing things the way we've always done them. The Israelite midwives are testimony to this. They lived by another code, a life-giving code. They understood their role as making holy mischief. I deeply resonate with this image of faithfulness, and I invite you to connect with it as well. Our tradition is not just about obedience and guilt and heaven and hell and dogma and creeds. Jesus did not talk about any of these things. Jesus invited people to see the world very differently and to find ways of living out of generosity and hospitality and forgiveness and justice and courage, and when required, civil disobedience. That's what those midwives practiced. So this is a bit of an addendum. Maybe it fits, maybe it doesn't. I was asked at the retreat, not our retreat, the women's retreat last weekend, whether or not I would call myself a committed Christian. What kind of Christian would that be? I asked. That word has been associated with some really horrific stuff like residential schools and witch burning and the Crusades and colonialism and guilt and sexual abuse and sexual guilt. So I have chosen to speak about my relationship with this tradition in a much different way. Sometimes I describe myself as one who seeks to follow the way of Jesus. I prefer to say that I am an heir of this tradition. I've inherited some of the troubling stuff. And I've inherited some of the finer stuff. But I do feel deeply called to animate, to give life to the best this tradition has to offer. And like my parents, I do this with a profound recognition and respect for what other traditions have to offer. There are a number of elements that need to come together to give life to this story. Leadership with a vision is essential. And you need to know that I am really grateful to this circle of friends for honoring what I have to bring to the table. The statistics around clergy depression and burnout in this era are high. And 50% of women who enter ministry leave after their first charge. 50%. Churches want to live, but they don't want to change. Isn't that a recipe for severe mental health issues in ordained clergy? In the weeks to come, we will look at the other components required to animate, to give life to this ancient tradition, and at that point, I will hold the mirror up the other way. It is a tradition that invites us to live out of the same spirit as those Egyptian midwives, who rather than obeying the Pharaoh, participate in holy mischief. During this time for contemplation, consider a time when you abandoned the rules or the way it's always been done and chosen instead to participate in holy mischief. Or maybe you've been afraid. Or maybe your own religious baggage kind of held you back. If that's the case, how can we as a circle of friends serve as the midwife for your desire to live abundantly?